Hi, I'm Celine. Welcome back to my channel, and I thought it would be fun to do one of those tier rankings of all of the books that I've read in 2023. I've read about 70 books, I've got 5 tiers, and because it's 70 and I don't really want to be filming for 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to have to be quite fast. So I'm going to try to be brief. But if there are certain books that you are really interested in or that you would just like to hear more about, do let me know in the comments and I might think of some other fun video ideas to talk a bit more in depth about those books. Alright, so let's have a look. This is what we're working with. We've got 5 tiers and they are divided in Chef's Kiss, which is fantastic, amazing book. Would love to reread it, might have already reread it within the same year. Delightful, possibly a masterpiece. The next tier is Great Times Were Had. These are books that I just think are fantastic. They're not quite on the level of favourite, but I had a really excellent time and would highly recommend it. The next tier down is Very Good Indeed, which are books that are just very good. You know, they're not quite at the same height as Chef's Kiss or Great Times Were Had, but they are very good. And then we have the tier Fine, which is a book that I read, I enjoyed. It didn't make me mad or angry necessarily, but it wasn't a book that necessarily stuck with me. And then at the bottom tier we have Not For Me. I actually did consider making an additional tier at the very bottom for books that I really, really detested, but I realized that on this pile of books that I have here, there are actually no books that I detest because none of the books that I hated this year I finished. And this is all books that I've read completely. So instead of, adding another bottom tier, I literally just have Not For Me, because if I hate something, I just don't finish reading it. In terms of this pile of books that I have here, they are in chronological order. So this is the first book that I finished in January 2023, and we'll sort of make our way through it. They might have gotten a little bit mixed up, but it'll give you a bit of an impression of my reading year and how that developed over time. So the first book that we have is Twee Vrouwen by Harry Mulisch, which is a Dutch author, and the title would be Two Women in English. Harry Mulisch is one of those great figures of Dutch literature. He's one of those authors that you just can't really get around if you do read Dutch literature. His most famous work is The Discovery of Heaven, which I think has been translated and was quite popular outside of the Netherlands as well. This is the first book that I've read by Mulisch, and I'm going to go with fine. It was fine. It's about 2 women who are in a romantic relationship, and it's a little novella, and it draws a bit from myth, classical myth. But in terms of the story, I just can't really say that it stuck with me much. And there was some sexual content that just raised an eyebrow. Just a little bit like, Harry, what were you thinking? Which sadly is quite a common feature for Dutch literary fiction, contemporary literary fiction. There's always weird sexy times. I don't know why. Next up we've got The Grand Sophie by Georgette Heyer, which is a historical romance. And I really enjoyed this, but it did take me a long time to read. I am going to say Very Good Indeed. It was very amusing. There were some really funny things in this one. So it was definitely a book that I enjoyed. I don't remember that much from it, and it didn't really make its way into one of my favorites. But it was one of those books where I read it, I enjoyed it, and I thought, I would be very happy to read more by Heyer because I think her writing style is really pleasant. Next up is one of the very few books of speculative fiction that I've read this year. That's definitely something I might want to look into for, 2024, is to read it a bit more. So Leech is a horror novel, but it's also sort of science fiction, futuristic, apocalyptic, set in like the north, and there's snow and there's parasites, and honestly this was fantastic. I am going to put this in Chef's Kiss. I loved this book, and I think it's a shame that Ennis hasn't written or published anything else yet, because this was a really just so intricately built, very well plotted, fascinating story that I it's a standalone, but I just want more. Next up, we have a book which is very hard to read. I think this is De Verborgen Bron by Helle Haase, which is again a Dutch book. The title would roughly translate to The Hidden Source, something like that. I think this one is going to go into very good indeed. This was my second book by Helle Haase, and she is considered one of the classic authors in Dutch literature, not English literature. I read a lot of that too, but that's different. And quite a lot of her books are about colonialism and Dutch colonialism in Indonesia particularly. This is not one of those books. This is a novella about, I think, a man who goes back to his wife's hometown, something like that. I enjoyed it. It's been a while, you know, it's been about a year since I last read it, but I really enjoyed Haase's writing style. I think she's a really good writer. So I'm going to put this in very good indeed. Then we have Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, and this is the second book in the first trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings fantasy series. And Robin Hobb is definitely one of the greats of fantasy, and she is a really, really good writer. However, her books are really long, and I'm not entirely sure that they deserve to be quite as long as they are. I think the last half of this book was excellent. The first half of this book felt kind of a repetition of the first book. So I'm going to put this in very good indeed, because I did have a good time, especially in the last half, which for the length of this book, you know, I had a good 400 pages that I really enjoyed. So I think it deserves to go into this tier. You can tell I've read quite a bit of Dutch literature at the start of last year. So next we have Arthur Jappa's Een Schitterend Gebrek, which is a novel about Casanova's, the woman that Casanova loved, and he broke her heart. And this is one of those historical fictions, and I have like this really specific personal vendetta against this type of historical fiction that features a woman and it's all just about how terrible her life is. Like, it's just filled with bleak horribleness, and it's gonna go in not for me. I did not enjoy this book. I can recognize why it's part of, you know, Dutch literature and why it's deemed really good. I don't disagree with that, but I did not enjoy it. Next up we have a contemporary romance. Maybe I would not call this a romance, but that is a story for another day. This is going to go in not for me. I quite like Beth O'Leary. You know, sometimes when you just want a light book with like fun characters, silly interactions, just something a bit breezy, but with enough substance to make you feel like you're not just turning pages for the sake of it. For those kinds of reads, I really enjoy Beth O'Leary, and I think I've probably read most of her books. The No-Show was sadly my least favourite. I swear we'll get to the English classics in a moment, but first we have Mapping the Interior, which is a short story by an American horror author. I'm going to put this in very good indeed. It was very different from a lot of horror that I've read, and in that sense I thought it was really good. It also includes a lot of Native American culture, which I also really enjoyed, so it is going into very good. Then we have The Awakening by Kate Chopin. Perhaps controversial opinion, it's going to go in Chef's Kiss. I love this book. I think it's fantastic. I think it's way ahead of its time. I think the writing style, the characterization, the subtleness of the themes is all amazing. It's going to go into Chef's Kiss. I realize that it's quite a depressing book, and I know it upsets a lot of people that the content of it induces a lot of emotions for some reason, but I think it's fantastic. So Chef's Kiss. Next is Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake. I read this for an in-person book club, and I had never read anything by William Blake. And I have to say that when I first read it, I would say that it was not for me. There's like this nursery rhyminess about especially the Songs of Innocence that I just did not vibe with. But after discussing it and after, hearing other people's perspectives, seeing more of the themes, how they resonated across the Songs of Innocence and Experience, I'm going to put it in fine. I have to say my appreciation for it has actually increased. So, it deserves a little bit more credit than it has at the moment. Then we have The Pearl by John Steinbeck. This was my first Steinbeck. I didn't really know what to expect. I actually thought it was going to be like Hemingway. I had this idea in my head that Steinbeck and Hemingway just both wrote about war, and that was it. The Pearl is nothing like that. And I'm not sure. I think I'm going to put it in fine. I did enjoy it, but I'm not entirely sure I fully connected to the themes and the intentions of Steinbeck with this story. Then we have The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, and this is, it's the first one. This is Great Times Were Had. I really enjoyed this. It's a very interesting combination of slapstick comedy as well as quite horrifying things that happen, like sort of psychological terror inducing in other people. Like the villain just terrorizes some people, which is awful, but at other times it's also really funny. And this was a book that I really enjoyed, but there will be another H.G. Wells in a little moment that I enjoyed even more. Then we have Breakfast at Tiffany's. For some reason, I thought Breakfast at Tiffany's was a romance. I don't know what happened there. It really isn't a romance. It's definitely literary fiction. I really enjoyed this. I'm not sure whether it's Great Times Were Had or Very Good Indeed. I'm going to put it in Very Good Indeed. It was very entertaining. I think if you're coming from genre fiction, perhaps the open-endedness of the ending might bother you. That didn't bother me, and I thought the writing was really good. Then we have The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, which, by the way, in terms of the title, chef's kiss. Like, I think this might be the best title of books I've read this year. This is a short collection of, I don't know if it's essays or possibly lectures that have been turned into essays, maybe a combination of the two, by the feminist thinker Audre Lorde. This was really good. I'm going to put this in Great Times Were Had. Were great times had in terms of, was this an enjoyable, uplifting read? Maybe not. It's, talking about oppression is simply not very fun. But I did think in terms of her thought, it was very good. And I definitely found some interesting tidbits in this. Talking about oppression, let's talk about A Room of One's Own. Now, I think this is the book that set me off on the massive Virginia Woolf binge that I've been on this entire year. A Room of One's Own is very famous for positing that in order to be able to write, women need space. And there is, the argument of physical space, but what's often not mentioned is that Virginia Woolf was also very much concerned with having mental space. Basically being able to separate themselves for women to, be able to think about more than just the family, the husband, and, the social duties of being a wife. I think this goes into Great Times Were Had. This is an excellent book. It's a classic for a reason. I do think there are other books by Virginia Woolf that I enjoyed even more, but is very, very good. Then we have Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. Now, technically this book should be in this pile twice. It's not, because I read it twice in 1 year. I first read it in English, adored it, and then read it in German as well. So I don't think it can go anywhere else except in Chef's Kiss. What a beautiful book. It's wonderful. You know, it is literally letters to a young poet. So Rilke receives a letter from a young poet who is asking for advice, who's asking for feedback on his poems, and Rilke responds with such compassion in such a nice way that even though, you know, it's been over 100 years since he wrote these letters, but I think they really, really stand the test of time, and it's fantastic, and I will probably reread it again sometime in the future. Speaking of writing and writers, we've got On Writing by Stephen King. This was also a reread for me. I read this because the book club wanted to read it, and I had already read it twice, I think. But, you know, I was like, third time's a charm. I think for me, this goes into Great Times Were Had. This is a combination of writing advice as well as a memoir of Stephen King's own writing life. And it was written, I think, in 1999. And that is something you do have to keep in mind, that some of his advice is, you know, over 20 years old. So is it relevant? Maybe. I would say it takes a grain of salt. So what I find fascinating is the memoir part. I do think the writing part in itself is also interesting, but I just quite like Stephen King. Some people in our book club detested it, couldn't stand his voice. So, you know, you might like it, you might not like it. I really like it. Next up, we have The Island of Dr. Moreau, and this is the H.G. Wells that is going to go into Chef's Kiss. There was so much in this book that was so interesting, and just, I don't know, this one really hit for me. This was the book where I was like, yes, I'm just fascinated by this. I read it within a day, maybe two. It was great. It's about this guy who ends up on an island, and there is something wrong, and you might already know just through cultural osmosis what's wrong, but I will not spoil it for you. The main theme of this book is, what does it mean to be human? And it's fascinating to me. I think it's a classic, a science fiction classic, for a reason. Next is Medieval Women by Henrietta Leyser, and this was Great Times Were Had. This is a non-fiction book about medieval women, and it is relatively old. I think it was written in the 90s, but in terms of scholarship and in terms of taking a really measured approach and like focusing on very different areas of women within medieval history, because, for example, you know, a farmer's wife will have a very different life from a nun, and I think this book really makes that clear, just the very different paths that the lives of women would take in this time. Then we have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. Oh, maybe I should have made an additional tier at the very bottom, because I feel like that is where this book belongs. I did not like this whatsoever. This is my very least favourite Bronte book out of all the Bronte books I've read. This made me dislike Anne Bronte, even though I think she wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I quite enjoyed, which I would say is probably around here. But this one, I could not stand the main character. It was dreadful, and it's going to go down there. Then we have De Profundis and the Other Prison Writings of Oscar Wilde, which includes the long poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. I know a lot of people say Reading Gaol, but it's Reading Gaol because it's the jail of Reading. The way Brits pronounce their place names makes absolutely no sense, but, you know, that's beside the point. I would say, once again, you know, I'm going to put this in Great Times Were Had, even though Oscar Wilde did not have a great time in prison, and, you know, but it made good art, so let's put it over there. Then there's a book without a cover, because I read The Innocent Mistress by Mary Picks, which is a play from, I think, the 17th century, but I couldn't find a good cover for it, so it's just going to go like this. I'm going to put that in very good indeed. I really enjoyed the play. There were some really fascinating elements to it. For example, there's cross-dressing and tons of relationship shenanigans, and it was very enjoyable. The Soul of Man Under Socialism. This is an essay by Oscar Wilde. I'm going to put this in very good indeed. I think Oscar Wilde is a fantastic author, and in terms of his stylistic choices, he's great. I found it really interesting to learn more about his political beliefs. I'm not sure this is, a very fun read or exciting read or necessarily something I think about much. Then, my nemesis, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And I say my nemesis because this is the book. I have started it so many times. I actually had to read this for my PhD. I didn't finish reading it for my PhD. It haunted me. But I made it and it's going to go in fine. I would say the first 200 pages, I just don't like it. I can't say why. It's just poor orphan Oliver Twist, just being unlucky constantly. And it does not give me joy. Dickens is a great author, but he just doesn't sell me on Oliver Twist. But it is a good book. It's, I get why it has endured. So, fine. I'm willing to put it in fine. A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. I would... where does this go? Great times are had? Very good indeed. I'm going to put this in very good indeed. In terms of the writing, I thought it was very good. He is on a sentence level, he just has that really nice 20th century terseness where even the smallest details loom very large. I think he's fantastic at that. But I found the ending somewhat unsatisfactory because part of this story is about a young woman learning to basically grow a spine, basically develop her own opinion and be less led by the people around her. And then by the end, she is still being led by people around her, and I didn't feel like she actually developed much of a spine whatsoever. So it deserves to be in this sort of middle tier, I think. Then we have The Story of My Life by Helen Keller. And Helen Keller is a really fascinating person. Due to an illness, she became both blind and deaf while she was still really young. So she knew how to speak a little bit, I think, before this happened. But she basically went through life both blind and deaf. But she did, go to university. And I think in terms of disability perspectives, this book was great. I think what made it slightly less interesting for me is that she wrote this when she was early 20s, and you can just tell that she's very much at the start of her life. She's still very young, and I found that in terms of her insights in things that have happened and just being able to perhaps conceptualize her own life, I just felt like she wrote it too early in her life. It is, though, in terms of disability history, a fantastic book, and I would recommend it, but I would say the experience of reading it, I am going to put it in fine. We have a collection of Emily Dickinson's poetry, and this was a relatively short collection. Ooh, difficult. I find Emily Dickinson, sometimes I feel like I'm vibing with the poetry, I get what she means, but a lot of the time it just feels like a bag of words. There are words on the page, I know what the words mean, but it does not congeal into any sort of meaning, and I just don't get it a lot of the time. So I'm going to go with fine. I feel like maybe I need more of a background in poetry. Poetry is still relatively new to me, for me to actually fully appreciate the genius of Emily Dickinson. The Tempest by William Shakespeare. Ooh, this is a difficult one. I'm going to put it in very good indeed. This is a play where people are being shipwrecked, there's this magician, and he's going to do his grand revenge. What I found silly, I was waiting for his grand revenge. I was like, oh yeah, in the last act, this is all going to... His grand revenge was just so underwhelming. To me personally, other people might disagree. And I feel like the lack of a really strong ending dropped this down a bit. I think if the ending had been more convincing to me, then it would be higher. Then we have Passing by Nella Larsen. I actually did a video about Nella Larsen's works. Ooh, difficult. Is it Great Times Were Had or Chef's Kiss? I think I'm going to put it in Chef's Kiss. This was very good, and it is a work that I think about a lot. Also, the movie is really good too. It's on Netflix if you are interested. Silas Marner by George Eliot, the first George Eliot I've read. I'm going to put this in very good indeed. This was good. I think Eliot has a lot of compassion for human nature. She also has really great insight in human nature, and I was quite satisfied with the way this all wrapped up. I found the first half of it, I just wasn't really sure where all of this was going, but it was a very good read. Intentions by Oscar Wilde. This is more of his essays. It contains some, they're like platonic dialogues where one person takes one position and the other person is basically just there to support the expressing of that position. I'm going to put this in fine. I could really tell Wilde's classical education. I am sadly not much educated in the Greek and Latin classics, so I felt like a lot of it went over my head. Some of the parts I enjoyed, some of it I just had no clue, so it's going to go into fine. The Love Letters of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. This is a selection of the correspondence. Ooh, this is difficult. I am going to put this in Great Times Were Had, I think. Mainly because the letters have sometimes been shortened, and that really annoyed me. I am nosy. I want to know absolutely everything they wrote to each other, because sometimes the little details are really revealing, and I think it's a shame that those little details weren't included in this book. I'm assuming to make it a manageable book. It's not that long, it's about 250 pages. But the letters in themselves and just the letter writing is wonderful. If you want to read something about Sapphic women in history, just, pining for each other across the seas, this is the book you should read. The Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde. This is quite a funny little short story about an American family who I think buys a haunted British mansion, and is humorous and says a lot about how Oscar Wilde viewed Americans and how he viewed Brits. It is fun. It's very good indeed. It's not super memorable in terms of characterization. It's not, it doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it's a very good time. Cecilia by Fanny Burney. I'm going to say Great Times Were Had. This is a very, very long book. It's a book that inspired Jane Austen, and I've made a separate video about this book, but I thought it was really, really great. There were so many elements to this book that I wasn't expecting. It's 18th century fiction. It's about this woman who is being torn between three different guardians, and she has to find her own way. And there's some delicious melodrama in it, and it was just very amusing. Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. This is also going to go in Great Times Were Had. Even though at one point in the book I did not have a great time, but I think in terms of the quality of the writing for the work as a whole, in terms of what Dostoevsky manages to do, and in terms of literary innovation, I think Notes from Underground is fantastic. So it is going to go in this tier. Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken. Ooh, this is a difficult one. It's going to go in either one of these. This is about the rise of ultra processed food, so food that has gone through very extensive industrial processing, and what it might be doing to our health. In terms of the research, it's still relatively early, so the full image has not been revealed yet, but I did think it made some really compelling arguments, and I think it's quite an important book and just an important topic for us all to think about, and think how food culture has changed a lot over the last couple of decades, perhaps the last 100 years, compared to a very long period of time before that, in terms of, the way people used to eat used to be relatively constant. Obviously crops have come and gone, yes, but food culture was relatively stable until now. I'm going to put it in Great Times Were Had. I found this a really compelling, interesting non-fiction read. A Writer's Diary by Virginia Woolf. Very easy. Chef's kiss. This was fantastic. It is exactly what the book says. It's parts of Virginia Woolf's diary, and they're chosen by her husband after her death that pertain to her writing process, that pertain to, when she thinks about reviews, when she thinks about her writing. This was fascinating. I absolutely love learning more about people's personal lives, and yeah, it was great. She's such a fantastic writer, and she uses her diary almost like a training ground, and you can see how that transformed into her finished, published literary works. Journal of a Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Great Times Were Had, even though people were absolutely not having a great time. I feel like I mislabeled this category a little bit. This is about the plague that hit London in, I think, the 17th century. And it's like this, it's fictional because Daniel Defoe he wasn't old enough during that time to have been able to do the things that the narrator says. But it's also non-fiction in the sense that it is trying to be, it tries to give you an image of what happened during the plague years. How did people respond? What were the rules that were set, including things like quarantine, isolation? It was fascinating to read this after having, lived or are still living through our own pandemic. And yeah, the fact that human nature has not changed whatsoever in the last 400 years, fascinating, really, really good book. And the fact that it might have been fictionalized does not, I don't think, detract from the book at all. Then we have Letter to a Young Poet by Virginia Woolf. I would put this in Great Times Were Had. This is a really nice little letter of advice by Virginia Woolf for poets, young writers, and I found it quite inspiring, so it will go there. Portrait of a Marriage by Nigel Nicholson. This is a portrait of the marriage of Vita Sackville-West and her husband, and they notoriously had an open relationship where they both had romantic relationships and sexual relationships with people of the same gender that they were. If that makes sense. Vita dated women and her husband dated men. And this is a tough one because it also includes writings by Vita Sackville-West, and I think Vita Sackville-West is a fantastic writer. Those memoir pieces I loved. Nigel Nicholson, her son, I'm sorry, but isn't really a great writer, and I sometimes found him a bit, I don't know. It's just a little bit irritating at times. So it's very hit and miss. I'm going to put it in very good indeed. There were some really interesting parts because it also includes some of the correspondence between Vita and her husband, and I thought that was really fascinating. But in terms of some of the texts around it, not my favourite, but I don't regret reading this whatsoever. Salome by Oscar Wilde. Not for me. I do not understand this play. I also felt like in terms of writing, it's just not close at all to what Oscar Wilde usually writes in terms of language. I found it really repetitive. It was originally written in French. Maybe that has something to do with it, but it wasn't for me. Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is a non-fiction book about, it's supposed to be about creativity. It's mainly about writing. And I read this book in one afternoon. I did find it inspiring to a certain extent, but I would also say that I don't really vibe with Gilbert's beliefs because she has I don't know, one of the core tenets of this book is that ideas are abstract entities that are just floating around, and then we need to be open to them so they can like come at us. But if we're not open, then the idea will just go to a different person. And that just doesn't really, I don't really believe that, sadly. Then this is the second common reader. Oh, there's the first common reader. I did not read the second common reader before I read the first one. Common reader, Chef's Kiss. Second common reader, does it also go in Chef's Kiss, or is it maybe Great Times Were Had? These are two non-fiction, you could call it a collection of essays, but they are actually written as one whole, and it's about reading. And it's basically Virginia Woolf telling you about the history of British literature. It's mainly focused at English language literature. And it also focuses on life writing, so biographies, memoirs, that sort of thing. Fascinating, amazing. She's such a fantastic writer. 10 out of 10. Loved it. Lord Chesterfield's Letters. All Lord Chesterfield wants is for his son to brush his teeth, flirt with some women, and go into politics. Does his son do that? Absolutely not. Fascinating. I really enjoyed this. I'm going to put this in Great Times Were Had, even though the content of the letters is actually quite repetitive. But I don't know, I just love these insights into people's lives, and yeah, it amused me probably way more than it should have. Ace by Angela Chen. I am going to put this in fine. So this is a book that is all about asexuality, but the subtitle of the book is What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and Meaning of... Is that sex? Yes. I would say that in terms of talking about asexuality, I think this book did an excellent job. It really interviews a lot of different intersections of asexuality. So it looks, for example, at disability. How does that intersect with it? In terms of what it reveals about desire and society and meaning, I didn't feel like it went far enough. I was more interested in that aspect because in terms of, you know, accepting asexuality, I was already there. I didn't need the self-help portion of this book really, or the, you know, the experience accounts and stuff like that. I was already on board. In terms of deep insights, I just didn't really feel like it was there. A Man and His Cat. I'm going to put this in fine. This is a manga about a man and his cat. He adopts an ugly cat that no one loves, and he loves it with all of his heart, and it's very sweet. However, it has a ton of cat puns. Now, I love a good pun. I love a good cat pun. They kept making the same cat puns, and after, you know, 50 pages of the same puns, I lost the will to live a little bit. But it was cute, and I can see why a lot of people like it. I am not super keen to keep on reading. I feel like I've got my, you know, my measure of cuteness for the day. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I think Great Times Were Had. This was really good. I really enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. These are the meditations, the philosophical contemplations of a Roman emperor, and I found it surprisingly relevant as well as surprisingly interesting. The Grasmere Journals of Dorothy Wordsworth. This is going to go into very good indeed. I thought this was really fascinating. Mainly about the relationship that Dorothy Wordsworth had with her much more famous brother, William. But also the way that she writes herself and how Wordsworth, the brother, took sentences and basically read her diary sometimes for his own poetry. And at the same time, the book also contains just a wealth of just everyday things, like, I washed my hair today. I don't know why that's interesting, but it is interesting to me. Goodness me, I've read many books. Next, we have The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. Is going to go in fine. It's about a terror attack, and it's told in a interestingly non-chronological way. Some of the writing was excellent, some of it I just didn't really love, but it was good. So it's going to go into fine. The writing's really small on this, but I think this is The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. This is fine as well. This is a book about really rich people. Like, think Great Gatsby. Rich people being miserable, and it's all their own fault. Three Guineas by Virginia Woolf. Such a hard read. It's about feminism and war. It's very good. It's very rage-inducing. And I understand why A Room of One's Own is the feminist work that people remember by Virginia Woolf because it's just more accessible. Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe. This is a gothic novel and it was very good indeed. It was just a rollicking good time. It's not too long, like the nature descriptions aren't endless, which they can be with Anne Radcliffe. There were enough shenanigans, there were enough things going on that I had a really good time. Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. Oh, Shirley. I adored part of it. I detested other parts of it. It's going to go into fine. I've just not been very successful with the Brontes lately, I think. A Midsummer Night's Dream. Great times were had. This is such a fun play. It's a comedy. So many shenanigans. Very, very amusing. Quicksand by Nella Larsen. I also think great times were had. This was an excellent book. I think passing, I enjoyed it more, but both are really great. The Essays of Virginia Woolf. I'm going to go quickly because I feel like I'm not getting through this. Chef's Kiss. Love it. These are collections of her reviews, things that she wrote for newspapers, all kinds of stuff. Wonderful, delightful, great. Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I read this in German, which was great. Very good indeed. This was really good. It's not, the type of story that I vibe with usually, but it was very good and I definitely don't regret picking it up. Orlando, Chef's Kiss. It's just a row of Virginia Woolf at this point. Loved it. This is a book that Virginia Woolf wrote for Vita Sackville-West, and it just does things with language that I had never seen before. It discusses the passing of certain centuries in a way that I loved. It's fantastic. I tapped up my coffee to absolute smithereens. It was great. Ooh, The Adventures of Mrs. Seacole. Great times were had. Love Mary Seacole and her entrepreneurial spirit. She's great. And I'm really glad that she has been getting more recognition over the last couple of years as well. Burnout Society. So this is philosophical nonfiction about basically hustle culture. That's what it boils down to. I'm going to put this, it's going to go either in one of these. Let's put it in fine. In terms of ideas, I think this was great. The author is a philosopher, you can definitely tell. It felt like in terms of as a book, this felt like it was a couple of conference papers that were glued together and they did not flow into one another. Yeah, I'm not sure that as a book it necessarily worked. In terms of ideas and in terms of insight, I thought there was a lot in this. So if it is a topic that you're very interested in, you might want to pick it up. Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Another difficult one. It's going to go somewhere here. Maybe very good indeed. There were some sections in this that I really adored. This is a novel in verse. It's very religious, and I'm not religious, and there were aspects of this that just didn't really... they didn't work for me. But I do think it's very well written. I think the project of it was fascinating. So we're going to put it in very good indeed. How to Live on 24 Hours a Day by Arnold Bennett. So this is like a self-help book, but over 100 years old. I'm going to put it in very good indeed. I really enjoyed this. I would like to make a video about it some other time. Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti and Other Poems. I'm running out of space, but let's put it in very good indeed. This was very good. I think Christina Rossetti is a fascinating poet. Like, she sometimes has these light-hearted things, but then she also has a lot of poetry about death. Very interesting. Let's move this around a little bit. I think I'm almost at the end. Is this the last one? No. Okay, Tender is the Flesh. Literary fiction, recent fiction. Whew. It was a book. It was a journey. Is it very good? Is it very good? It's going to go into fine. I was mesmerized by it. I think there are definitely parts of it that are very interesting. I don't think it really changed my insight into the themes that it talks about, mainly about consumption and just the cruelty of killing animals for food, but also generally like consumption in capitalism and how cruel that is. Then we have The Diaries and Journals of Literary Women from Fanny Burney to Virginia Woolf. I really enjoyed this book. It's exactly what it says on the tin. It's an academic work about the diaries and journals of various literary women. I'm going to have to make this a little bit smaller. Oh, goodness me, you cannot read those titles, but you know, we're gonna go with it. This was very good indeed. Really enjoyed it. It's a little bit outdated because it was written in the 90s, but I thought there was a lot of insight and it made me interested in some new authors that I hadn't read much about before, so that's always positive. Oscar's Books by Thomas Wright. This is a non-fiction about Oscar Wilde's library. Fascinating. Really, I think, interesting to see what literary influences influenced Oscar Wilde. But I think in terms of structure, this book just, it could have been amazing, but it ended up just being very good. Difficult. Let's put it in very good indeed. I do feel like I learned a lot. I feel like I got a lot of insights. I also think that the author really put a lot of effort into the scholarship. In terms of, I just don't feel like it quite reached the height that it could have. But, you know, it's still very good. Mr. Magic by Kiersten White was fine. This is a contemporary horror book by an author that I usually really love, but this book just didn't quite hit for me, so it's going to go into fine. And finally, we are at the last book. Goodness me, this video took forever. Editing me is going to be so sad about this, but you know, it is what it is. Last book, Invitation to the Waltz by Rosamund Lehman. I've seen some people say that this was influenced by like stream of consciousness writing. I'm not sure I agree. I definitely think that it has some looseness in terms of literary style, and it does hop a little bit from sort of the, you know, narrators like being quite standoffish into going into perhaps the main character's thoughts. But I wouldn't say that it's anywhere close to Virginia Woolf's, for example, Mrs. Dalloway, in terms of how far it goes into these meanderings. I actually think that Invitation to the Waltz is very easy to read and definitely not confusing or anything like that. I enjoyed this and I think it's going to go in very good indeed. Right. So these are the 70-ish books I've read in 2023. In terms of distribution, I had an excellent reading year. I mean, if you look at all of this and then the not for me category only has 4 books in it, and there were some books I didn't finish. I didn't include that in this video because I just didn't really feel like it. There was enough to talk about, but it really feels like I had an excellent reading year. You know, even the amount of fine books is quite small compared to basically everything that I thought was really good. So yeah, I feel like I had a great year. In terms of favourites, it's not a surprise to me that it's just a lot of Virginia Woolf. But I'm not complaining about it. I think it's great. I had a really good time. I just let myself read whatever. You'll see that it's quite an eclectic bunch, hence the channel name. But I feel like this kind of reading really allows you to just be distracted by something fun, like reading a book about processed food, or medieval women, or horror, contemporary horror. I don't know, I think this was a great success, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's not too long. I hope you maybe found some books that you would also like to try. Also, let me know how your reading year went. Did you feel like you read the kinds of books that you wanted to read? Are there maybe different types of books that you want to give a try in this year? I would love to hear more about that, and I also hope to see you again soon in a different video. Bye!